So my research question was, where should we focus our moose conservation efforts in Vermont? And so some background information, the reason why I chose this question was because over time, especially over the past 20 years, we've seen very sharp moose declines in Vermont. As you can see from this diagram from Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, in 2005 there were 4,800 moose in Vermont, and by 2015 there was less than half of that number. We only have 2,070 in Vermont. And the reason for this decline can be mainly attributed to winter ticks. So winter ticks really impact the health of moose over time, and they have been shown in Vermont specifically. This is a study done by Vermont research grad students. So they impact the birth rate and make the birth rate of moose very low because of the declining adult moose health. So only 57% of adults gave birth, adult females, and then only 49% of the calves ended up surviving. And so winter ticks are linked to 74% of the mortalities within moose in Vermont, and they can be attributed to 91% of the calf mortality is due to winter ticks in Vermont. And another reason why I chose to study this, and another reason they're declining, would be vehicular accidents with just cars hitting moose in roads. And this definitely isn't as big of an issue as winter ticks, but as many as 50 moose can be killed each year in Vermont because of car crashes. So the methods I used is I downloaded a bunch of research-grade iNaturalist observations in the state of Vermont. There were 450 total research-grade observations that ranged from 2002 up to 2020, and I did decide to include scat/track observations as long as they were research-grade. And this is my first figure, and this figure shows all of the different observations organized by the different Vermont counties to figure out where we should focus our conservation efforts. I thought that this would be a good model to make, and as you can see, Essex County was an extreme outlier, and there were much more observations in Essex than any other county. So then I decided to standardize all of these observations by dividing the number of observations by the area in square miles of each county to get average density, and that is how I came to figure 2. So as you can see, this is a heat map based on the different densities of moose per square mile used by the iNaturalist observations, and Essex County was such an outlier that the heat map only showed Essex County. So then I decided to create another figure where Essex County was removed so that we could have a better scale that didn't include an outlier to make a heat map for the rest of the Vermont counties. And as you can see, now we can see that Addison County and Lamoille County also have decently high moose densities in Vermont. And since the main question is where we should focus our conservation efforts towards moose, one of the main places that we get our data, that the state biologists get the data, are actually just observations from hunters and people who observe moose. So I decided that knowing the time of day as well as the season and time of year that you're most likely to see a moose would also be important for their conservation efforts, so that we would know when you're most likely to see one and make observations that can then be sent to the wildlife department. So the first figure shows the hour of day and how many observations were seen based on the hour of day, and there is a peak at around 4 p.m. And then the second figure, figure 5, shows the number of research-grade moose observations made by the month they were observed. And as you can see, in May and June, there were the most observations. So to talk about the results, we saw a high concentration of moose in Essex County, and that is consistent with what the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department has also seen. And the hunting area for Essex County is E1 and E2 that you can see in the map to the right. And so one way that Vermont is actually trying to conserve moose is by hunting them, because they realize that there's such a high concentration of moose within Essex County up in the Northeast Kingdom, that there's more than one moose per square mile, so it's actually detrimental to moose because there's so many moose that winter ticks are thriving up there. So they're trying to actually decrease the moose densities up there so that there's less winter ticks that are killing the moose. So they have, for the year 2020, recommend 55 moose permits only, and they're only allowed to hunt within the E1 and E2 regions, and they're expected to see about 33 hunters bring in moose. And then in terms of the month, we saw that May and June were the most likely seasons to see it, and that makes sense because that is moose mating season. However, our result that we saw the most observations at 4 p.m. does not exactly make sense because moose are technically most active at dusk and dawn, so I do think that there were some bias within using iNaturalist data, just because not everyone's going to get up at the crack of dawn to go make moose observations or iNaturalist observations or hike. So it's a very limited audience that we would get during those times to be observing moose. And same goes for really late at night. And then also there's some bias with iNaturalist users because sometimes things can be research grade, but then it changes. So the SCAT results in particular, potentially there could be some error. So in conclusion, I think we should, to answer the question, I think we should focus our conservation efforts in Essex County, but kind of the opposite of what you would think. I think we should focus on getting the density within Essex County down by promoting moose health and moose habitat in the other counties in Vermont so that we can spread out that outlier of having so many moose in the Northeast Kingdom into other counties of Vermont so that the density is more spread out, and that way we can obtain a less than one moose per square mile in Essex County, but then also get a healthy amount of moose, which is less than 0.7 moose per square mile found within all of the different counties in Vermont. And we can do that by enhancing moose habitat and minimizing vehicular crashes in all the other counties of Vermont. And also we should focus on continuing to report moose observations, seeing as how this is the main data source for the state to get information about moose.